Hi, class. I hope you all are having a great day today. I am here with you to talk about the writer Toni Morrison and her short story from 1983, Recitatif. So I chose this story for a number of reasons. Number one, I'm a big fan of Toni Morrison. I once had a professor who said that she has the lyricism of a poet and the wisdom of a sage. And that really stuck with me. I feel like there's no better way to describe Toni Morrison than that. Her writing is so beautiful, and the themes that she touches on are so important. She is also one of the most important and acclaimed by both readers and critics, American writers of the 20th century. And also, right, worth noting, she is the first Black woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And that was in 1983, or I'm sorry, 1993. So the story that I assigned for our class is called Recitatif. And it is actually her one and only short story, right, that she ever wrote. She wrote 11 novels, but just this one story. And I really love this story because number one, it's about female friendship. So the focus is not on these individual women's stories. We see that their characters are only developed when their lives intersect. So the first time, right, when they're 8 years old at a children's home in New York in the 1950s, and then throughout the story, we see that they run into each other 4 more times as adults, the last time when they're in their 30s. Okay, so I'm guessing they're in their 30s. I'm guessing that because Twyla has a son who's graduating from high school. So each time they meet as adults in the outside world, right, each of these meetings is a surprise, and we see a shift in the power dynamic between them. So that makes us ask ourselves why, right? How have the circumstances of their lives changed them and changed the way they view and treat each other, right? So we saw initially, right, they share a brief but very formative moment when they're united at age 8 and their feeling of being dumped, right? They're abandoned by their mothers. And then as we read the story, we see that bond change, right? No doubt, right? Partly due to the differences in their race, their class, and also privilege. Which leads me to, right, the very interesting and unique thing about this story, right? Toni Morrison said that it was an experiment, right? Her intention was to write a story about two characters of different race, right? She tells us one is salt, one is pepper, right? So one is Black, one is white. Yet she does not state which character is Black and which character is white. So instead, she leaves it up to us, the reader, to decide. Right. So is Twyla Black and Roberta white? Or is Roberta Black and Twyla white? So we never actually know for certain, right? She never discloses the race, which makes us ask ourselves as we're reading, right? Do we make assumptions about the characters and their race based on our own social conditioning? Right. In the story, we see the kind of prejudices and assumptions that are passed down from their parents. Right. So, for example, Twyla at the beginning of the story says something like, "My mom won't like you putting me in a room with her." Right. Right. Why? Right. Because of this other girl's race. And that she also says at the beginning of the story that her mother told her that they never wash their hair and they smell funny. Okay, so we get a lot of statements like that that make us question, right? What is the race of these two girls? Right. So the story makes us question the kinds of things that we have been conditioned to believe about white people and about Black people. And it's impossible, I think, for us to read the story without filling in the clues as to which race the girls are, right? And then ultimately, we must ask ourselves, does it even matter? Okay. How does the story make us confront our own perceptions, right? Our stereotypes, our unconscious biases about race and about class. Right? If we actually knew which girl was white and which girl was Black, would we think differently about them? Okay, so these are all thoughts that we're having as we're reading the story. I also really like the themes that Toni Morrison suggests in this story, right? So number one, right, she makes us think about what ties us together as people. So as I mentioned, right, these two girls, they meet when they're only 8 years old. And we have to think about the nature of childhood friendships, right? Often childhood friendships have a very lasting impact, right? A very profound effect on our lives. And I think another theme the story presents is memory. Right. So we see the way we remember shared experiences differently. Both Roberta and Twilight have different memories of their experience at St. Bonnie's, right? More specifically, their memories of the character Maggie and the way they treated Maggie. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But the way I think also our childhood memories, they take on a very important resonance, right? And also, right, we think our memories are infallible, but our memories, right, might not actually be as reliable as we think. And then also certainly themes of identity issues. So as I mentioned, race and class. And also she makes us think about prejudice. And then also finally, I think neglect and abuse. Right. So these are all themes that this very short story, touches on all these very interesting ideas. And that's one of the main reasons why I chose it for us to read. Okay, so now let's say a little bit about the writer, Toni Morrison, and then I'll get into more specifics about the story. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can pull up some pictures of Toni Morrison so you can look at those as I'm talking here. Move me out of the way. All right, so here she is, Toni Morrison. So you can see she lived from 1931 to 2019. So she died right before COVID, right? She never knew anything about COVID. She was 88 years old. As I mentioned, she is primarily a novelist, right? She published 11 novels. She also wrote a number of essays. I just listed some of her notable awards, right? I could keep on listing. She won so many awards, but these are the big ones: the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, the American Book Award, and then also the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So a little bit about her life. Let me move me over here. Right, you might be wondering, Toni Morrison, why does it say Chloe Wufford on that picture? That is because when she was born, right, her parents named her Chloe. Now she was born in Lorain, Ohio. And Lorain, Ohio, if you go on to read some of her novels, you'll find that many of her works of literature are actually set in Lorain, Ohio. And so her birth name, Chloe, she, felt like a lot of people didn't pronounce it correctly. People sometimes struggled when they saw the name. And so she's Catholic. And her baptismal name, right, named after a saint, was Anthony, after Saint Anthony of Padua. And so Anthony, right, is often shortened into Toni. And so she, people started calling her Toni, and she liked that name. So she, continued to use that name. So she got a bachelor's degree at Howard University, which is in Washington, D.C. That was in 1953. The degree was in English. And then she went on to graduate school at Cornell University, where she earned a master's degree in American literature. Also, kind of interesting, I think, is that she wrote her master's thesis on Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, right? Two of my favorite modern writers. And she focused on their treatment of the alienated. It's I think, very interesting. Let me move forward here. So she was married for 6 years to a man who was Jamaican, and he was an architect, and his name was Harold Morrison. She did keep that last name after their divorce. They had two sons. Their sons are named Ford and Slade. And Toni Morrison raised their sons on her own as a single mother. Now, unfortunately, very, very sad, her younger son, Slade, got pancreatic cancer, right? In 2010, he was 45 years old. And now you might know pancreatic cancer is one of the most deadly of the forms of cancer that people can get. It's often very quick, right? And it's also very difficult to treat. And so he unfortunately died. And this was 9 years before her own death. And that was a really serious trauma that she went through, right? Her son's illness and death. She also had, right, she had a full-time career, right? So she was the very first Black female editor at the publishing company Random House, right? One of the biggest publishing companies. So she worked there in the 1960s, right? She worked there all the way up until 1983. And she finally left then in 1983 to devote more time to her writing. She also was the chair of humanities at Princeton University from 1989 to 2006. I'm sorry, 2006. Some more pictures of her. She died, as I mentioned, in 2019 of pneumonia, and she was 88 years old when she died. Get some more great pictures of her when she was older. Okay, so I wanted to just say a little bit about some of her novels, right? Maybe encourage you to read her books. So her very first novel was published in 1970. And I feel like it's very interesting. She was 39 years old when she wrote her first book, which is, a little bit older than some of the other writers, which really goes to show, right, that here she had this full-time career as an editor, was writing on the side, wrote this amazing novel, The Bluest Eye, published in 1970. Now, I just chose some of the different covers for the novel. I always feel like it's very interesting the way novels are packaged, marketed. So this book is very controversial. So you can see what I've typed on the screen, that it has appeared on the American Library Association's top 10 list of banned books, right, for the years 2016, 2013, 2014, 2020, and 2021. And it also, right, appears on the advanced placement reading list, which kind of seems a little bit contradictory, right? So simultaneously, this book is praised as being extremely important, right? That all students should read this book, while it's also a banned book, right? A challenged book. Okay, now why, right? Why is it challenged? Why is it so frequently banned? Well, right, because it is about incest. It's about so much more than that, but we learned that one of the main characters, a young girl named Piccola, that she is raped by her father and that she gets pregnant. Okay, so I chose a quote from Toni Morrison, which is, "I put the whole plot on the first page. In fact, in the first edition, the plot was on the cover, so that a person in a bookstore could read the cover and know right away what the book was about and could, if they wished, dismiss it and buy another book. Okay, so I actually happen to be using this novel, The Bluest Eye, in my American literature class this semester. And, so I have the book handy. And so that sentence that she's referring to, putting the whole plot on the first page, is the sentence, Piccola was having her father's baby. Okay, so like just that phrase. So that's the first sentence, right? Well, actually, it's the second sentence. But you might read that and think, oh gosh, I don't want to read a book about this. So she does disclose that the book is about incest. In the whole book, right, she goes on to say that, right, she's not going to explain why this happened. Rather, she's going to show us how, right, how something like this could happen, right? How could that happen? Now, right after its release, this novel was actually hated by many people in the Black community because of its portrayal of incest. And also interesting to note, I think, is that Toni Morrison, after it was published, she only made $3,000, right, from after the publication. Now, again, like I said, I used this novel in my American literature class. So maybe right after taking English 2, you feel like, oh, I want to keep on reading. Maybe I hope maybe you'll take my class again. I only teach American literature on campus. So it's an on-campus class that meets twice a week. And it's English 42, American literature from the Civil War to the present. Okay, and this is one of the books that I assign. So I just want to say a little bit more about a few of her other important books, and maybe some of you have heard of these. So in 1973, her second novel is called Sula, and it's also about a friendship between two women. It was nominated for a National Book Award. Then in 1977, she published Song of Solomon. It won a National Book Critics Circle Award and also a Book of the Month Club selection. And then in 1981, she published Tar Baby. And it was finally right after she published that novel that she felt like she was a writer and that she could quit her day job, right? Her full-time job as an editor. And then she published in 1987 the novel Beloved. Okay. Now, this book won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was then made into a film in 1988, right? The film starred Oprah Winfrey and Danny Glover. Now, the novel was inspired by the true story of an enslaved Black woman who kills her daughter rather than have her daughter live life as a slave. Okay. And now the dead baby of the daughter returns as a ghost that haunts the mother and her family. So it's a very, very beautifully written, very tragic novel. The film, I will admit, it wasn't as successful. Partly, some people speculate it was 3 hours long. It just didn't do as well as maybe we thought it might do because the novel was so good. Then she wrote Jazz in 1992. That novel is about a love triangle. And that was after that, her son died. And then the first book she wrote after her son's death, the novel Home. And then she wrote in 2014 the novel Paradise. And I'm not putting all her books on the screen here, just the ones that really kind of stand out to me. And then I really highly recommend her collection of essays and speeches and meditations. And that is called The Source of Self-Regard. Very, very good book. Let's see here, what else do I have here? Okay, I just also put some pictures of Toni Morrison. As I mentioned, right, she won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012. She also, right, in 2023 was issued, right, a US stamp with her picture on it. Very prestigious honor, right? Have your own stamp. And then I'm not going to play this right now. I played in my on-campus classes, and I really highly recommend that you go on YouTube, right? I guess you're already on YouTube right now watching this video, but that you watch this video. The New York Times, shortly after Toni Morrison died, they made this short, it's only maybe 5 minutes video, really just highlighting some key moments from her life. And it's so well done. It's a beautiful video. So I definitely recommend that you check it out. Okay, so I want to try to keep it brief, but yet I want to say some things about the story that I asked you to read. So let's start by identifying the setting and the point of view. Okay, so our point of view, maybe I'll start with that. We see we're back to the first person. So, right, we have a narrator, right? And this woman, this girl is telling the story from her perspective. Okay, so who is the character that is the narrator? Well, that is Twyla, right? So one of these girls, again, we don't know if she's the black girl or the white girl, she's telling us the story. So everything that we come to know is filtered through her mind. So we're in her mind as we're reading. So we have to keep, we have to keep that in our mind, right? Okay, the settings. So we start off, as I mentioned, when both Twyla and Roberta are only 8 years old. And they both have been brought from their homes, right, removed from their homes and brought to this children's home in New York State in the 1950s. Okay, so this is a home. Most of the children who are living there are orphans, right? We know that there are 130 children living there and that 90 of them are under the age of 12. Okay, so it's a closed environment. They're living there. And, we come to see it's a very brief moment in their lives. They're only at this home for 4 months together. So they're together for just 4 months, but yet it is a very, right, formative moment in their lives. And I would say, it's fair for us to use the word innocent, right? They're innocent children. It's a time of innocence. And their bond is very strong because they are roommates, right? They're together, but also they are unlike the other children there, most of the other children there, because they're not orphans, right? They don't have beautiful dead parents in the sky, right? No, their mothers are very much alive. They were both dumped. That's the word that is used. They were essentially abandoned, right? They were removed from their homes and brought to this children's home. Okay, so this bond that they have is really, I think, contingent on the fact that they don't ask each other a lot of difficult questions, right? Twyla points out that, right, Roberta doesn't ask her questions like, right, why were you abandoned? Why were you dumped? Right? What's going on with your mother? She doesn't ask those kinds of questions. That would be very painful, right? And Twyla appreciates that. So initially, I feel like that is like the source of their bond. They have a lot in common. Okay. Now we come to learn that their mothers, right? There's no mention of their fathers at all. So that's interesting. But these mothers, right? These absentee mothers, that Twyla's mother goes out at night dancing. She leaves her daughter at home alone to go out dancing. And that's why Twyla was removed from her home. Okay, so that word dancing, what exactly does that mean? Is she literally like out dancing every night? We maybe think that this is actually sort of like a code for, you know, what kinds of things would a young woman be leaving her home to go out at night to do? Is it going to bars? Is it prostitution? Some people have speculated, drinking. We don't really know. Whereas Roberta's mother, right, the reason why she's been removed from her mother's home is because her mother is sick. Okay, now, again, is this a code for something sick, mentally sick, physically sick? When we actually see the mothers, right, we get some more clues, right? When the mothers do come to visit, we see that Twyla's mother is dressed in kind of like ratty clothing, tight clothing, right? She doesn't bring the lunch. She seems kind of irresponsible in some ways, whereas Roberta's mother is, wearing a very big, like cross, a crucifix necklace. She's very religious. She has a Bible with her, but yet she brings a very like elaborate lunch, very, well-packed lunch. Okay, so we learn these things. So we can say Roberta and Twyla, that they both start on a similar path and that they're vulnerable, they've been abandoned, right? But as we read on and as we come to see them as they grow, that we see that they have been treated differently by society, right? Due to race, class, and privilege. Okay. So the first setting, right? St. Bonnie's. And again, like I said, they're only there for 4 months. Okay, now then, right, each of their encounters that we see after that, each of the next settings that we see, it's a surprise. They don't plan to meet, they just run into each other. Okay, so the first of those meetings is at the Howard Johnson's restaurant where Twyla is working. And this is their first encounter as young adults. And we see a very profound shift in the power dynamic, right? Twyla, who's working as a waitress, she assumes that Roberta will be, happy to see her, that they will connect in the way that they did when they were young. Okay, but we see that Roberta reveals a callousness, right? A coldness, a willingness to be disconnected from that bond, right? Why? Okay, well, we kind of have to ask ourselves why. Is it because a lot of time has gone by? Is it because of the boys that she's with? Is it because Twyla's working as a waitress in a restaurant? Is it because of their race? We don't really know, right? Roberta later in the story suggests that it was because of their race when she says, right, oh, Twyla, you know how it was in those days, black, white. You know how everything was. Okay, so Roberta seems to blame race. Okay, we don't really know, but we do pick up on, right, the different way that Roberta is treating Twyla in that moment. Okay, and there's lots of clues, right? We could get into these clues about their race. Okay, then the next encounter we see is 12 years later. So it's 20 years, right, since they met at St. Bonaventure, St. Bonnie's. So now they're 28 years old. And they run into each other at this food emporium, right? This grocery store in Newburgh. And, this is, again, their second encounter as adults and very different, right? And because now Roberta is seemingly very happy to see Twyla. Okay, so now it's like, oh, let's get a coffee together. Let's talk, let's catch up. So we have to wonder why now is Roberta more open to their bond, to sort of reestablishing the bond. But we get some more clues, right? And I kind of brushed over the clues that we got at the beginning, which maybe I'll go back to just for a moment. And actually, you know what? I'm going to share my screen so we can actually look at the story really quick. So you probably noticed the link I provided wasn't working, so I had to actually scan my book. So you can see I've got, some notes written in the margins. Just ignore those, right? But we had saw at the very beginning of the story when they first meet, right? I had mentioned, right, that they don't ask each other hard questions. But we get, right, these clues about race, And so we see that, again, Twyla's the narrator. And so that Twyla says, right, that, that initially to the big bozo, right, the woman in charge, oh, my mother won't be happy that you're like putting me in a room with this girl, right, a girl from a whole other race. Okay, well, why? Why would her mother not approve of that? Again, we're kind of thinking about the kinds of prejudices that parents sort of like share with their children that are passed on. And so then we see the clue, right? Why, right? Why wouldn't the mother want the child in there? Well, every now and then she would stop dancing long enough to tell me something important. And one of the things she said was that they never washed their hair and they smell funny. Roberta sure did smell funny, I mean. Okay, and that's why she says, my mother won't like you putting me in here. Okay, so that's a clue, right? And in my class, sometimes a number of my students say the second big clue for them is when they meet in the Howard Johnsons. And remember, Roberta says, "Oh, we're on our way to see Jimi, Jimi Hendrix concert." I've had some of my students say, "Oh, well, that must mean that Roberta is Black because she's going to see Jimi Hendrix," and I'm kind of like, I'm not, I think both white and Black people love Jimi Hendrix, so I'm not sure. But again, it just these clues that are dropped in, for us. Okay. Now, I feel like in that second meeting, in my opinion, the clue that stands out the most is so Twyla notices that Roberta, and they're both married now, that Roberta seems to have a lot of money, right? Because she has a limousine with a driver. Okay, like who has a limousine with a driver? So in the way she's dressed and the kinds of like food she's buying, again, they're shopping at a very fancy, exclusive grocery store. Kind of reminds me of like a Whole Foods or something. And then there's the line, and this I feel like again, this is the sentence that really, to me, I think is a clue. And let me just pull it up on the screen really quick. I can go to page 2259. So, okay, so here it is, right? So, right, Twyla's looking at Roberta and noticing how wealthy she seems to be. And right here on the bottom of the page where it says, she's looking at her shoes, her dress, everything lovely and summery and rich. I was dying to know what happened to her, how she got from Jimi Hendrix to Annandale, a neighborhood full of doctors and IBM executives. Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. Okay, so as I read that, right, everything is so easy for them. In my mind, I feel like that suggests that Twyla is Black and that Roberta is white, right? I can't imagine a white young woman saying, or I'm sorry, a Black young woman saying, right, everything is so easy for them, right? So I feel like a Black woman would probably say that about a white woman, that everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. Okay. But again, I've said that in class with my students, and my students say, no, I don't think so. It probably has to do with something else. Right? I had a student once who said that because Roberta is described as being more beautiful, that's what that meant, that it's easier for people that are beautiful. Okay. Again, I love the way Toni Morrison keeps it ambiguous. We don't know, right, which woman is Black and which woman is white. Okay, so back to our settings, right? So after this grocery store encounter that is very friendly, they run into each other again, right, on, of all places, a picket line. Okay, so we come to learn that in this time period, in this place, there is racial desegregation of the public schools is going on. Okay, so Twyla supports the busing of her son to another school, whereas Roberta is against it. And so they run into each other, and there's some conflict, right? We see that they have changed even more than the last time we saw them, right? And that we notice that, Twyla makes a comment, it's not a free country yet. Okay, again, that also kind of makes me feel like she's the Black character. And then we see Roberta is again very cold. She doesn't help Twyla when the women surround and rock her car. And then, right, we start to pick up on the significance of the character Maggie. Okay, and I'll come back to her at the end. And then the last encounter, so the last of the four settings, is when they run into each other in a diner on Christmas Eve. Okay, so that's their last meeting that we hear about. Again, it's a surprise meeting, it's not planned. And that we see in that last meeting, Roberta reveals something, right? She reveals something about Maggie. Okay. And also, I should point out in that last meeting, many years have gone by, so much in these women's lives have changed. But the one thing that remains the same is that they both have problematic mothers, right? Because they disclose, yes, my mother is still dancing. And Roberta discloses, yes, my mother is still sick. Right. So the same thing that they haven't had in common from day one remains, right? Something that they share. Okay, so I mentioned in passing a couple of times this character, Maggie. So let's talk about her role in the story, right? What is the significance of this character, Maggie? And I remember when I first read this story, I was a student at UCLA, and I loved the story. But I remember the first time I read the story, I didn't really like the sections that touched on this character Maggie, right? I was more interested in reading about Twyla and Roberta, and every time Maggie came up, I was kind of like, let's get to Twyla and Roberta. But now I feel like I understand why Toni Morrison used this character, Maggie, right, to further the story about these two women, Roberta and Twyla. So Maggie, we learn that she was raised in an institution and that she works at St. Bonnie's. She is the kitchen woman who works there. And we learn a little bit about Maggie's past, more specifically, that she was raised in an institution. We come to learn that Roberta's mother also was raised in an institution, and that Maggie, does not talk. Okay, so they use the word mute. Okay, so she's voiceless. And that she's now, quote, old and sandy colored, and that she dresses like a kid, and she has legs like parentheses, which suggests that she's bow-legged. Okay. So, what's important about all of this? Well, at St. Bonnie's, we see she is lowest on the social hierarchy because of the fact that she's mute, right? She acts like a child. She works in the kitchen. And we see that many of the girls at St. Bonnie's, right, the older girls, they bully her. Right? They taunt her, they make fun of her. And because she's mute, she's voiceless, she can't fight back. Right? She's this sort of passive victim that the girls sort of take out their anger and frustration on. And when Twyla and Roberta run into each other, right, at the grocery store, they bring up Maggie, and Roberta says that both Twyla and Roberta, that they participated in the bullying, right? That they pushed her. Okay. And so, this is again that theme of memory and the way we remember things. They both have a different memory of the way they interacted with Maggie, right? Twyla's like, I never did that. I would never do anything like that. And Roberta's like, yes, you did, right? You're calling me a bigot, and yet you pushed a black lady. Okay, and then Twyla's like, what? Maggie wasn't black. Okay, so again, this issue of race. What race is Maggie? Is she black? Is she white? And, also, does it even matter? Right? Because I feel like that's really what Toni Morrison is getting at. Does the race of these women, does it really matter? And if so, why? How does it matter? Okay. Now with Maggie, we come to see at the end of the story that it seems that Maggie reminds both women, both Twyla and Roberta, of their mother. Right? So Roberta's mother was raised in an institution just like Maggie was. And we see, right, that later in the story, Roberta suggests that they took their anger out on Maggie because really they were taking their anger out on their mothers, right? And even Twyla at the end of the story reflects, right? She says, Maggie was my dancing mother. Okay, maybe I'll share my screen so I can pull that up. Okay, so here, when at the end of the story, this is the last page. So they're talking again. This is in the diner on Christmas Eve. And we see, right, that Twyla is saying, I really did think she was black. I didn't make that. Oh, I'm sorry. This is Roberta. Excuse me. I didn't make that up. I really thought so. Right. I just remember her as old, so old. And because she couldn't talk, well, I thought she was crazy. She'd been brought up in an institution like my mother was, and like I thought I would be too. But you were right. We didn't kick her, right? It was the Gar girls. Remember, those are the older girls. It was them that kicked her, only them. But, well, I wanted to. I really wanted them to hurt her. I said we did it too. You and me, but that's not true. And I don't want you to carry that around. It was just that I wanted to do it so bad that day. Wanting to is doing it. Okay, so that was Roberta explaining that she wanted to hurt Maggie because Maggie reminded her of her mother. Okay, so, again, this really is a very interesting point. And it reminds me a lot of a work of literature we talked about a few weeks ago. So you hopefully remember the poem by Thomas Lux, The Swimming Pool, right? Where we saw, right, this quality that we observe sometimes in human nature, where we see vulnerable people taking out their fear and their anger on weaker people, right? People who are below them on the social hierarchy. Okay, so both Roberta and Twyla, right? Again, they started out on a similar path, and that they were both abandoned by their mothers, dumped, right, by their mothers, right? Very vulnerable position to be in, right? And we see over the course of the story how they change, right? And why do they seem so different? Well, we can say that it probably has to do partially with the way that they've been treated by society, which probably has something to do with their race and their class. Okay, so such a wonderful story, right? So short, but Toni Morrison, I feel like she brings up so many important themes, right, that resonate, right? And she makes us think about, right, the way racist thoughts are perpetuated constantly because your subconscious is subjected to ideas without your consent. So the story does bring up unconscious biases around race, right? There are a lot of unanswered questions. So we can say that this story is definitely a good example of an open ending. Okay, so by the end of the story, Toni Morrison never tells us what was Twyla's race, Roberta's race, or Maggie's race. She leaves that open, right? So it's all about nuance and ambiguity. And one more thing about characters, this is also another story where we see some really good examples of dynamic characters, right? Both Roberta and Twyla change throughout the course of the story. So we can say even that this is an example of a coming of age story, right, about two young women. Okay, so I really hope that you enjoy the story. I can't wait to read your comments on the discussion board. I also hope, right, that you're starting to work on your essays, okay, because that due date is coming up. So I will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.